The gold leaf embossed invitation sitting on my mahogany desk was 3 weeks old. It had been sent not to my residence but to my office building's general receiving mailroom, shoved inside a plain manila envelope without a handwritten note, without a personal greeting, and without a stamp of affection. It read, "Honoring 4 decades of uncompromising corporate excellence, the official retirement gala of Senior Vice President Arthur Vance. Grand Ballroom, the Ritz-Carlton. Dress code, black tie mandatory." Below the printed text, written in my father's sharp, rigid handwriting with a black fountain pen, was a single handwritten line at the bottom margin. "Ethan, do not attend. This is a high-level executive gathering for Meridian Global's board members, institutional investors, and political leaders. Having an unemployed, uncredentialed son wandering around in cheap clothes will only create uncomfortable questions about my personal family legacy. Stay at home." I stared at those words under the soft LED lights of my corner office on the 42nd floor of the Sovereign Tower. Outside my floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline stretched for miles. A vast, glowing grid of glass, steel, and concrete, illuminated against the midnight sky. Below me, the yellow lights of late-night taxis crawl along the avenues like tiny beads of gold. In my right hand, I held a sleek, titanium-encrypted hardware key. Resting on the glass surface of my desk was a leather-bound corporate acquisition dossier stamped with 3 red words across the cover. Project Olympus, Final Asset Purchase Agreement. Inside that folder lay a legally binding, fully executed contract detailing the total corporate buyout of Meridian Global Logistics, a multi-billion-dollar international logistics conglomerate. The buyout had been executed quietly over 8 months through 4 layered subsidiary entities. The primary shareholder, holding 72% of the voting equity and owning the sole, unilateral authority to appoint the board, terminate executive officers, and liquidate corporate divisions, was a private holding firm called Aegis Strategic Capital. And I was the sole founder, chief executive officer, and majority owner of Aegis Strategic Capital. My father had spent 40 years grinding his life away for Meridian Global. He had sacrificed his marriage, abandoned his eldest son, lied, manipulated, and stepped on dozens of colleagues just to climb to the position of Senior Vice President of European Operations. He viewed that corporate title as the ultimate validation of his human worth. To Arthur Vance, a man's identity was determined entirely by his place on a corporate hierarchy chart, his country club membership, and the price of his wristwatch. He genuinely believed I was still the broken, quiet 19-year-old kid he had kicked out of his house 12 years ago, with 2 cardboard boxes and $400 in savings, because I refused to follow his prescribed corporate path. He had no idea that the company he spent his entire life bowing down to was now completely owned by the son he had discarded. I picked up the black fountain pen, gently tapped it against my desk, and looked down at my reflection in the dark glass. "I won't stay at home, Father," I whispered into the quiet room. "I'm coming to your party." To understand Arthur Vance, you first have to understand the toxic environment of suburban corporate vanity. I was born into a household where love was not a feeling. It was a transaction based entirely on performance metrics. My father grew up in modest circumstances, the son of a railroad mechanic, and he spent every waking moment of his adulthood carrying a burning, insecure despair to prove that he belonged in the upper echelons of society. He measured human value through visible status symbols: the neighborhood you lived in, the brand of suit you wore, the titles printed on your business cards, and the prestige of the university logos plastered on the back of your car. My mother was a gentle, soft-spoken middle school literature teacher named Clara. She was the polar opposite of my father. She didn't care about luxury cars or country club galas. She cares about kindness, quiet intellectual curiosity, and moral integrity. She was the anchor of my early childhood. When my father was away on 6-week corporate business trips across Frankfurt, Tokyo, and London, my mother would sit with me in our small living room, reading classical history, teaching me how complex systems worked, and instilling in me a deep, unshakable sense of self-reliance. "Ethan," he would tell me on quiet Sunday afternoons, stroking my hair as the rain tapped against the window pane, "never let anyone convince you that your worth is determined by a job title or a piece of paper on a wall. The loudest people in the world are usually the weakest inside. True strength is quiet. Build your foundation deep into the earth, where nobody can see it, so that when the storm comes, you don't even shake. When I was 12 years old, my mother was diagnosed with an aggressive form of pancreatic cancer. During the 8 months she spent in hospice care, my father was rarely present. He was locked in a brutal corporate war for the vice presidency of Meridian Global's regional shipping division. I remember sitting by my mother's hospital bed on a freezing Tuesday evening, holding her frail, cold hands, while my father stood out in the hallway on his cell phone, screaming at a junior logistics manager about delayed cargo containers in Rotterdam. When she passed away, something fundamental inside our home died with her. The warmth vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, clinical atmosphere where every conversation felt like a performance review. 14 months after my mother's death, my father remarried. His new wife was Evelyn, a twice-divorced, status-obsessed woman who spent her days managing social committees and shopping at high-end boutiques. She brought her 14-year-old son from a previous marriage, Carter, into our home. Carter was everything my father had always wanted I was: loud, performative, obsessed with brand labels, and remarkably skilled at flattering authority figures. Carter learned instantly how to manipulate my father's ego. He joined the high school varsity golf team, memorized corporate jargon, and spent every family dinner echoing my father's political and business opinions word for word. I, on the other hand, was an introvert who spent hundreds of hours locked in my bedroom, immersed in computer science, economic theory, distributed ledger systems, and logistics optimization algorithms. I didn't care about golf. I didn't care about local high society dinner parties. I wore simple denim jeans, plain cotton t-shirts, and spent my weekends reading academic journals on algorithmic network topology. In my father's eyes, my quietness was a personal insult. My refusal to perform for his corporate friends was viewed as a deliberate rebellion. I vividly remember a specific evening when I was 17. Arthur and Evelyn were hosting an elaborate dinner party at our house for 5 senior executives from Meridian Global. The dining table was set with sterling silver, heavy crystal glasses, and catered 3-course meals. During the main course, one of the visiting regional directors turned to me with a polite smile. "So, Ethan," the director asked, taking a sip of wine, "you're a senior in high school now. I assume you're preparing your applications for Ivy League business schools, following in your father's footsteps in corporate logistics?" Before I could open my mouth, my father let out a short, dismissive laugh that cut through the conversation like a blade. "Oh, don't waste your breath asking Ethan about business school," my father said, leaning back in his chair with a patronizing smirk. "Ethan doesn't have the competitive drive for real corporate leadership. He sits upstairs all day staring at lines of code on his computer screen, playing with hypothetical math models. He thinks he's going to build some digital systems company. He lacks the social polish, the executive presence, and the grit required to survive in the real world." He then turned his body completely away from me, placing a heavy, affectionate hand on Carter's shoulder. "Now, Carter here, he's the real rising star of the family," Arthur continued loudly, his voice filled with pride. "Varsity golf team captain, already interning with our regional marketing team, and heading straight to State University for business administration. Carter understands how the real world works. He has executive DNA." The entire table chuckled politely. Carter puffed out his chest, smiling smugly across the table at me. I didn't argue. I didn't throw a fit. I didn't spill my drink or storm out of the room. I sat there in total silence, feeling the cold weight of my mother's silver necklace resting beneath my collar. I looked at my father's flushed, arrogant face and realized a profound truth. My father didn't want a son. He wanted an extension of his own ego. He wanted a trophy he could parade around at country club luncheons to validate his own deep-seated insecurities. The breaking point arrived 18 months later, during the summer after I turned 19. I had enrolled in a local state university, funding my tuition entirely through academic scholarships and a late-night job as a systems administrator for a local data center. During my free time, I was actively building the core software architecture for what would eventually become Aegis Capital's primary logistics tracking platform, an automated algorithm capable of predicting supply chain bottlenecks, optimizing multimodal cargo routing, and slashing international shipping costs by over 30%. One evening, I returned home from an 18-hour double shift at the data center, exhausted, my eyes bloodshot, carrying a stack of system architecture notebooks. As I walked through the front door, I found my father sitting in the dimly lit study, holding my laptop and 3 of my personal journals. He had gone into my bedroom, searched my desk, and broke the encryption on my personal storage drives. "What is this trash?" my father demanded, throwing my notebooks onto the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. "That's my private technical work, Father," I said, my voice quiet but firmly controlled. "Please put my laptop down." He stood up, stepping over the notebooks, his eyes burning with intense condescension. "Private technical work?" he sneered, stepping directly into my personal space. "You are 19 years old, living under my roof, wasting your time on useless coding fantasies, while your brother Carter just secured a full-time management track offer at Meridian Global's regional headquarters. I gave you a chance to apply for an entry-level clerk position in our shipping division, and you turned it down to keep playing with these digital toys. I turned it down because your shipping division uses 20-year-old legacy software that is wildly inefficient," I replied calmly, "and because I am building something of my own. I don't want a handout job at Meridian Global." My father's face flushed a dark, furious purple. He stepped forward, grabbed my arm and dragged me toward the front foyer. He opened the heavy front door, throwing my laptop bag out onto the wet grass of the front lawn. "You arrogant, ungrateful little brat," Arthur shouted, his voice echoing down the quiet suburban street. "You think you're smarter than a multi-billion-dollar corporation? You think you can build something better than the firm I've given my life to? You have no prestige, no connections, no money, and no real-world talent. Get out of my house. Go live on the streets with your little math problems. When you're broke, starving, and begging for a job as a night security guard, don't you dare come crawling back to me." He slammed the door in my face. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place with a sharp, final metallic sound. I stood on the damp lawn in the cold night air, listening to the light drizzle of rain falling through the trees. I picked up my laptop bag from the wet grass, wiped the water off the canvas strap, and checked my pocket. I had $412 in my bank account, a canvas backpack filled with 2 changes of clothes, and an unshakable belief in the systems I was building. I didn't cry. I didn't call him back. I turned my back on that house, walked 3 miles down the dark road to the local train station, and never stepped foot in my father's home again. The shadow years and the phantom empire. The next 12 years of my life were defined by an absolute, relentless focus that most people would consider pathological. I rented a tiny, 400-square-foot basement apartment in an industrial district of the city. The space had no central heating, a leaking ceiling, and a single window that looked directly out onto a concrete alleyway. My bed was a foam mattress laid directly on the cold linoleum floor. For the first 3 years, my diet consisted almost entirely of brown rice, canned beans, black coffee, and cheap eggs. I worked 20 hours a day. By day, I worked as a freelance systems security consultant, fixing broken network architecture for small manufacturing plants to cover my rent and electricity bills. By night, under the harsh light of a single desk lamp, I built Aegis. My mother's philosophy became my operational playbook. I decided very early on that I would build my business entirely in the shadows. I have zero interest in public fame, vanity press releases, tech magazine covers, or social media posturing. While other startup founders spent their energy pitching venture capitalists at high-profile networking events, taking glossy photos for LinkedIn, and throwing lavish launch parties, I was quietly focused on pure operational utility and revenue generation. The core technology I developed, the Aegis Logistics Optimization System, was a masterwork of mathematical efficiency. It integrates real-time satellite telemetry, global weather modeling, port congestion analytics, and dynamic fuel hedging algorithms. It can optimize global shipping routes in milliseconds, cutting transit times by 15%, and reducing operational overhead by millions of dollars for large-scale enterprise clients. When I was 23, I secured my first major contract with a private international commodity trading firm based in Geneva. They didn't care about my age. They didn't care about my lack of an Ivy League degree. They didn't care that I operated out of a small, unmarked office in a commercial industrial park. They cared about one thing. My system saved them $8 million in fuel costs during their first quarter of operation. By the time I was 26, Aegis was generating over $20 million in annual net cash flow. Instead of buying luxury sports cars, expensive watches, or high-profile mansions, I reinvested every single dollar back into the business. I hired brilliant, quietly ruthless quantitative analysts, maritime legal experts, and corporate acquisition specialists. I formed a private holding structure, Aegis Strategic Capital, registered through secure, private institutional trusts. We began quietly acquiring controlling equity stakes in critical infrastructure assets, private port terminals, specialized rail yards, automated warehousing facilities, and software patents. To the corporate world, Aegis was a phantom, a silent, insanely liquid private equity power that operated behind layers of institutional confidentiality. Meanwhile, from a distance, I watched my father's life unfold through public corporate news and family updates passed along by my mother's sister, Aunt Martha. Arthur's life was progressing exactly as he had always engineered it. He was promoted to Senior Vice President of European Operations at Meridian Global Logistics. He bought a massive custom-built estate in an exclusive gated golf community, drove a brand-new German luxury sedan every 2 years, and spent his weekends hosting extravagant dinner parties to flex his corporate status. Carter, my stepbrother, had been fast-tracked through Meridian Global's hierarchy thanks to my father's direct internal influence and nepotism. By 30, Carter was named Regional Director of Supply Operations. He carried himself with the exact same obnoxious arrogance as my father, wearing $5,000 tailored suits, posting glossy photos on social media, posing next to corporate jets, and lecturing local university students on executive leadership and self-made success. Aunt Martha told me that whenever my name was brought up at family gatherings, my father would wave his hand dismissively and change the subject. "Ethan is still off somewhere playing on the internet," Arthur would tell relatives with a disappointed sigh. "He never amounted to anything. He's working some low-level IT job in the city, barely making ends meet. It's a tragic waste, but some people simply don't possess the intellectual horsepower or discipline for true greatness." I listened to Aunt Martha's reports with a quiet, amused calm. I never corrected her. I never asked her to tell my father the truth. I let them believe whatever lies satisfied their fragile egos. Then, 6 months before my father's scheduled retirement, the global market shifted dramatically. Meridian Global Logistics ran into catastrophic structural trouble. For over a decade, Meridian's senior executive team, including my father and Carter, had made deleterious operational decisions. Obsessed with short-term quarterly profit margins to fuel their own executive stock bonuses, they have neglected modernizing their digital infrastructure. They relied on archaic manual logistics systems, took on massive high-interest corporate debt, and signed wildly unprofitable long-term shipping contracts with volatile European suppliers. When global supply chains experienced severe disruptions, Meridian Global began hemorrhaging cash at a terrifying rate. Their stock price plummeted by 65% in less than 6 months. Their primary institutional lenders refused to extend their credit lines. The board of directors was facing immediate, humiliating corporate bankruptcy and liquidation. Desperate to save the firm from public collapse, Meridian's board began looking for an emergency buyer, a private equity entity with enough raw cash liquidity to absorb their $3 billion debt load, privatize the firm, and restructure its global operations. They didn't know it, but my team at Aegis Strategic Capital had been monitoring Meridian's financial balance sheets for over 3 years. We knew every single vulnerability, every hidden debt obligation, and every bloated executive expense. 4 months before my father's retirement gala, I sat at the head of a massive marble conference table in the Aegis headquarters, surrounded by my senior legal team and corporate acquisition directors. "Director Miller," my head of legal affairs said, sliding a thick, leather-bound binder across the table to me. "Meridian Global's board is officially out of options. They are 3 weeks away from defaulting on their primary bond obligations. We have structured a private, all-cash tender offer through our acquisition entity, Project Olympus. We are offering to buy 72% of voting equity, absorb their debt, and convert the entire public firm into a privately held subsidiary of Aegis Capital. What are their terms regarding executive restructuring?" I asked, my voice calm and measured. "The board is so desperate for liquidity that they have granted us total, uninhibited authority over executive management," my legal director replied. "Upon closing, Aegis Capital holds unilateral power to liquidate any corporate division, terminate any executive contract without severity, and completely wipe out all existing executive stock option pools. I opened the binder. I looked at the list of Meridian Global's senior executive officers. Right at the top of the European Operations Division was the name Arthur Vance, Senior Vice President. Directly beneath it was Kierder Vance, Regional Operations Director. I picked up my pen, turned to the final execution page, and signed my name on the line marked Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, Aegis Strategic Capital. The acquisition was kept under strict, top-secret regulatory seals during the transition phase. The public, the press, and Meridian's middle-tier executive officers, including my father, were only told that a massive, highly secretive global investment group had purchased the firm and would assume full operational control immediately following the annual shareholder summit. 3 weeks later, the manila envelope containing my father's disinvitation arrived at my desk. The grand ballroom reckoning. The Ritz-Carlton Hotel was bathed in a warm amber glow under the towering crystal chandeliers of the grand ballroom. The air was filled with the rich, heavy scents of expensive perfume, aged scotch, roasted tenderloin, and fresh floral arrangements. Over 200 high society guests filled the room. Senior corporate executives, regional politicians, wealthy institutional investors, and bank directors dressed in sharp, black-tie tuxedos and floor-length evening gowns. At the front of the ballroom, elevated on a raised carpeted stage, stood a massive 12-foot banner printed with a high-resolution photograph of my father. It read, "Celebrating 40 years of visionary leadership, Arthur Vance." My father stood near the main stage holding a glass of 20-year-old single malt scotch, wearing a bespoke double-breasted tuxedo with gold cufflinks. He was surrounded by a circle of laughing corporate colleagues. Beside him stood Evelyn, wearing an emerald green silk dress draped in diamond jewelry, and Carter, who was strutting around in a designer tuxedo, loudly handing out his executive business cards to a group of young corporate analysts. My father was beaming with absolute unadulterated triumph. Tonight was the crowning achievement of his life. He was retiring at 65 with what he believed was a multi-million-dollar executive stock portfolio, a heroic corporate reputation, and absolute social dominance over his peers. At exactly 8:15, I stepped through the heavy glass double doors into the hotel foyer. I was dressed in a simple, perfectly tailored charcoal black suit made of fine Italian wool, paired with a crisp white shirt and a dark silk tie. I wore no flashy brand logos, no gold jewelry, and no expensive watches. On my lapel was a small, polished silver pin stamped with the minimalist emblem of Aegis Capital. Standing beside me were my 3 senior executive directors, my head of legal affairs, Marcus Vance, no relation, my chief financial officer, Elena Rostova, and 2 private executive security officers dressed in sharp suits with discreet earpieces. We walked calmly past the registration table, moving directly into the main ballroom. As we crossed the threshold, my stepbrother Carter happened to be standing near the bar, holding a champagne flute. His eyes drifted over toward the entrance, landed on me, and froze completely. He blinked once, twice, as if seeing a ghost. A cruel, arrogant smirk slowly spread across his face. He leaned over and whispered into Evelyn's ear, pointing his finger toward the doorway. Evelyn's face instantly twisted into an expression of deep disgust. She tapped my father on the shoulder, whispering loudly into his ear. My father turned around. When his eyes locked onto me, his warm, triumphant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a dark, furious glare. He handed his scotch glass to a waiter, adjusted his tuxedo jacket, and marched across the hardwood floor toward me, his heavy leather shoes clicking loudly against the floorboards. Evelyn and Carter followed right behind him like eager lieutenants. "What in the hell are you doing here, Ethan?" my father demanded, stepping directly into my path, his voice low, harsh, and trembling with suppressed rage. "Did you not read the letter I sent to your office?" "I received your letter, Father," I replied, keeping my hands resting loosely in my suit pockets, my voice entirely flat, calm, and conversational. "Then you are even more illiterate and disrespectful than I thought," Arthur spat, leaning in close so the nearby guests wouldn't hear his raised voice. "I explicitly ordered you to stay away from this event. Look at you. showing up to an elite corporate retirement gala in a plain black suit, trailing strangers behind you. You have no standing here. You don't belong in this room. These people are corporate chairs, bank directors, and international investors. You are an embarrassment. Evelyn stepped up beside my father, folding her arms, her eyes sweeping over my plain suit with total contempt. Ethan, honestly, Evelyn snickered, her voice dripping with venomous disdain. The sheer nerve of you crashed Arthur's big night. You spent 12 years ignoring this family, living like a failure in your little low-class IT world, and now you show up trying to steal a free meal at the Ritz-Carlton? Have you no shame? Carter chimed in right on cue, taking a step forward and laughing loudly so several nearby Meridian directors turned to watch. Hey, don't be too hard on him, Mom, Carter mocked, holding up his champagne glass with a condescending grin. Maybe Ethan finally realized his little coding hobby was a dead end, and he came here tonight to ask Dad for a security guard job at one of our regional warehouses. Isn't that right, Ethan? Want me to see if I can get you an entry-level application form in the morning? A few nearby junior managers from Meridian Global who were standing nearby let out quiet, suck-up chuckles, shaking their heads at me. I looked at my father, I looked at Evelyn, I looked at Carter. I didn't flush red. My pulse didn't jump by a single beat. I looked at them with the calm, detached pity a scientist feels when observing an insect trapped inside a glass jar. Are you finished? I asked quietly. My father's face flushed dark red. He raised his hand, pointing a heavy, trembling finger directly at my chest. Don't you dare use that tone with me, you innocent brat, Arthur growled loudly, attracting the attention of over 50 guests across the ballroom. I am the senior vice president of this company. I built this division with my own hands. I am getting security right now to have you, your friends, and your pathetic little presence thrown out into the street where you belong. My father turned to wave down the head of hotel security standing near the foyer. Before he could raise his hand, the heavy double doors at the front of the grand ballroom were once again pushed wide open. A wave of intense, sudden commotion swept across the room. Walking briskly down the central carpeted aisle came Julian Thorne, the world-renowned, highly feared Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Global's Global Parent Board, accompanied by 5 members of the Board of Directors and 3 international corporate attorneys carrying heavy leather document briefcases. My father instantly frozen. His eyes widened in absolute shock. Julian Thorne was an untouchable titan of industry, a man who rarely made public appearances and who had ignored my father's personal emails for years. My father immediately put on a desperate, servile smile, smoothed down his tuxedo jacket, and rushed forward down the carpeted aisle, leaving me behind, expanding his arms in an eager, fawning greeting. Mr. Thorne, members of the board! My father gushed, his voice trembling with frantic excitement and servility. What an absolute, unprecedented honor. I had no idea the Global Board would personally travel from London to attend my humble retirement celebration. Please, come right up to the head stage. We have the primary executive table reserved exclusively for you. Julian Thorne didn't slow his stride by a single inch. He didn't look at my father's outstretched hand. He didn't acknowledge Carter's formal bow. He walked right past my father as if he were nothing more than a piece of decorative furniture, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room. Where is Chairman Miller? Julian Thorne asked loudly, his authoritative voice echoing across the silent ballroom. My father stopped dead in his tracks, blinking in total, uncomprehending confusion. Who? Chairman Miller? Sir, there must be a mistake. This is the retirement party for Arthur Vance, Senior Vice President of European Operations. Julian Thorne stopped in his tracks, turned his head slowly, and looked at my father with a cold, incredulous stare. I know who you are, Mr. Vance, Thorne said bluntly, and there is no mistake. We are here on direct corporate orders to meet with the new chairman of Aegis Strategic Capital, the private entity that completed the total buyout and acquisition of Meridian Global Logistics 4 hours ago. A collective, violent gasp erupted across 200 guests in the ballroom. Bank directors dropped their glasses. Senior managers stared in absolute horror. A buyout? My father stammered, his face draining of every single drop of blood, his voice turning into an unmanly, high-pitched squeak. Aegis Capital? But who is the chairman of Aegis Capital? Julian Thorne ignored my father completely. He turned away, stepped past the head stage, and walked straight down the long hall toward the dark corner where I was standing. Thorne stopped 3 feet in front of me. He brought his hands together, bowed his head in a gesture of profound executive deference, and extended his hand. "Good evening, Chairman Miller," Julian Thorne said respectfully, his voice carrying clearly to every single ear in the silent room. "The regulatory seals have been officially lifted. The acquisition contract is fully executed. Meridian Global Logistics is now officially a wholly owned private subsidiary of Aegis Strategic Capital. The board of directors is standing by, awaiting your direct operational commands." The entire grand ballroom descended into a terrifying, suffocating silence. My father looked at Julian Thorne bowing before me. Then he looked at my quiet, calm face. Then he looked at the silver Aegis emblem pinned to my lapel. His jaw dropped so low it looked as though it were unhinged. His scotch glass slipped from his numb fingers, crashing onto the polished floorboards with a violent shatter that shattered the silence of the room. Ice cubes and scotch splashed across the polished leather of his expensive shoes. Evelyn gripped her chest, letting out a faint, terrified gasp as she staggered back against a pillar. Carter stood frozen, his eyes wide with absolute blinding horror, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled out of water. "No," my father whispered, his voice cracking, trembling violently as he took 2 shaky steps toward me. "No, no, that's impossible. That's a lie. You're Ethan. You're my son. You're just a kid who plays with math on a computer." My head of legal affairs, Marcus, stepped forward, opening a thick, leather-bound document binder stamped with the Aegis crest. "Mr. Arthur Vance," Marcus declared loudly, his professional voice ringing out across the ballroom like a legal hammer. "Allow me to clarify the corporate reality for you. The individual standing before you is Ethan Miller Vance, the founder, sole owner, and chief executive officer of Aegis Strategic Capital. Over the past 12 years, while you assumed he was failing, Director Miller built a multi-billion-dollar global logistics and private equity empire." Marcus turned a page in the binder, looking at my father with icy professional detachment. "4 hours ago," Marcus continued, "Director Miller's holding firm acquired 72% of Meridian Global's voting shares, absorbing all corporate assets and debt. Effective immediately, Director Miller is the sole owner of the company you have worked for 40 years. He is your ultimate employer, your landlord, and the sole authority over your pension and executive compensation pools." My pension?" my father gasped, grabbing his chest, staggering backwards as if he had been struck in the heart with a physical blow. "My executive stock portfolio?" Marcus looked down at the document. Under the emergency restructuring terms signed by the outgoing board to avoid total corporate bankruptcy, all existing executive stock option pools for senior vice presidents have been completely dissolved and converted into non-voting liquid capital to pay off institutional debt obligations. Your stock options are worth $0. "Zero?" Evelyn screamed, her voice piercing the silence of the room as she rushed forward, grabbing my father's arm in sheer panic. "Arthur, what is he talking about? What do you mean $0? Where is our money?" My father couldn't answer her. He couldn't speak. He stared at me with eyes filled with a terrifying mixture of shock, profound shame, horror, and complete disbelief. I took 2 slow steps forward, stopping directly in front of my father. I looked down at his trembling frame, at the scotch stain spreading across his leather shoes, at the massive 12-foot banner of his face hanging behind him. 12 years ago, Father," I said, my voice low, smooth, and crystal clear, "you threw me out of your house onto a wet lawn in the middle of the night. You told me I had no prestige, no connections, no talent, and no future. You told me I was nothing because I didn't fit into your shallow corporate world. You told me never to come crawling back to you." My father's lip quivered violently. Tears of absolute humiliation began welling in the corners of his eyes. "Ethan," Arthur whispered, his voice broken, begging, holding out 2 shaking, frail hands toward me. "Ethan, please. Son, I'm your father." "You are not my father," I said softly, looking him dead in the eye. "My father was a man who was supposed to protect me, believe in me, and guide me. You were just a man who worshipped titles, luxury cars, and the applause of strangers. You traded your real son for an illusion of corporate royalty." I turned my eyes slightly to look at Carter, who was cowering behind Evelyn, completely stripped of her arrogant posture. "As for you, Carter," I said calmly, "our human resources integration team will be conducting a complete audit of all regional management positions tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Any position secured through internal nepotism, rather than verifiable merit, will be terminated immediately without severity." Carter's face went dead white. He looked down at the floor, unable to utter a single word. I turned back to Julian Thorne and the board of directors. "Mr. Thorne," I commanded calmly. "Yes, Chairman Miller?" Thorne replied instantly. "Shut this party down," I said, looking out over the silent room of shocked executives. "Cancel the catering billing on the corporate account. Liquidate the European Executive Suite offices, and reallocate those funds directly toward our line-level warehouse workers' health benefits." "Consider it done immediately, Chairman," Thorne nodded firmly. I turned around, taking one last look at my father, who was standing frozen in the middle of the ballroom floor, surrounded by shattered glass and spilled scotch, entirely alone amidst 200 people who were now staring at him with pity and contempt. "Enjoy your retirement, Arthur," I said softly. Without waiting for a response, I turned my back on him, walked down the carpeted central aisle of the grand ballroom, and stepped out into the crisp, clean night air. The lesson and the aftermath. The aftermath of that evening swept through the corporate and personal lives of the Vance family like a devastating Category 5 hurricane. Within 48 hours, news of the dramatic acquisition at the Ritz-Carlton had spread across the entire international logistics industry. The story of the uncredited son who quietly bought the multi-billion-dollar corporation that disowned him became a legendary corporate tale, discussed in boardroom meetings, financial news outlets, and business school lectures. For my father, the consequences were total and irreversible. Without his executive stock option portfolio, which had been rendered completely worthless during the debt restructuring, his inflated net worth collapsed overnight. The lavish lifestyle he had built, the custom estate in the gated golf community, the luxury sports cars, the country club memberships, was revealed to be nothing more than a fragile house of cards, built on massive personal debt and anticipated corporate payouts. Unable to service his mortgages or pay his country club dues, Arthur was forced to liquidate his estate at a massive loss. He moved out of the gated community and into a modest two-bedroom rental apartment on the outskirts of the city. Evelyn, realizing striking that the wealthy corporate lifestyle she had married into was completely gone, filed for divorce 4 months after the gala. The legal battle over his remaining liquid assets drained whatever savings my father had left. Carter's fate was equally swift. During Aegis Capital's internal management audit, our legal and operational teams discovered that Carter possessed 0 verifiable qualifications for his regional director position. He had been hired solely through my father's direct internal pressure and had regularly passed off his junior team's work as his own. Carter was terminated from Meridian Global without severity, his name blacklisted across major corporate logistics firms due to the publicity of the audit. Last I heard, he was working as an entry-level sales representative for a commercial paper supply company in regional Indiana. As for my father, he spent his retirement days completely stripped of the corporate vanity that had governed his entire life. 2 years after the gala, I received a handwritten letter at my office. It was written on plain white notebook paper, the handwriting shaky and unconfident, a stark contrast to the sharp, rigid fountain pen scrawl he had used on my disinvitation years ago. It reads, "Ethan, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to write back. I am writing this letter not as a former corporate executive, but as a broken old man who realizes, far too late, that he spent his entire life worshipping dust. I thought I was building a legacy at Meridian Global. I thought my title made me a king. I was so blinded by my own weak insecurity that I failed to see that the greatest, most brilliant thing ever associated with my name was the son I threw away on a wet lawn. You were right. Everything your mother tried to teach me was right. True strength isn't loud. It doesn't need a head table, a gold badge, or a crowd of people clapping for it. You built an empire out of silence and discipline, while I built a mountain of straw out of noise and vanity. I'm proud of you, Ethan. Even if I no longer have the right to call myself your father, I am so deeply, profoundly proud of the man you became without me." Arthur, I sat at my mahogany desk on the 42nd floor of the Sovereign Tower, reading those words under the soft LED lights. I didn't feel a rush of malicious joy. I didn't feel smug triumph. I felt only a quiet, peaceful closure. The wound that had been opened when I was a 19-year-old kid, standing on a cold, damp lawn, was finally, completely healed. I opened my desk drawer, placed his letter inside a small wooden box beside my mother's silver necklace, and locked it. I never re-established a personal relationship with my father. Some bridges, once burned to ash by decades of cruelty and arrogance, are not meant to be rebuilt in this lifetime. But I ensured that his basic medical expenses and housing costs were quietly covered through an anonymous institutional trust, ensuring he would never starve or suffer in his old age. Not for his sake, but for mine, because I refused to let his past coldness dictate my present humanity. Aegis Strategic Capital continued its quiet, phenomenal expansion across global markets. We acquired sovereign infrastructure ports, automated clean energy transport networks, and advanced satellite routing systems. But despite our multi-billion-dollar footprint, our core company philosophy remains entirely unchanged. Our corporate headquarters has no flashy signs outside. We don't host vain media launch parties. We don't release boastful press announcements. We simply do the work, manage the systems, and let our results speak for themselves. On the wall directly behind my desk in my corner office, encased in a simple black wooden frame, hangs a single item. It isn't a copy of the multi-billion-dollar Meridian acquisition contract. It isn't a photograph of me standing with international heads of state or global market leaders. It is a small, framed piece of paper, the handwritten disinvitation my father sent me 12 years ago, with those sharp words written across the bottom, "Stay at home." Every morning when I walk into my office, I look at that frame for 3 seconds before I sit down at my desk. It serves as my permanent daily anchor, a reminder that a person's real worth is never determined by where someone else places them, that arrogance is always the quiet preamble to a catastrophic fall, and that the most powerful force on earth is a human spirit that quietly, relentlessly builds in the dark, while the rest of the world is busy making noise. Leave the word respect in the comments right now if you believe that true human strength is built quietly through hard work, character, and discipline, never through loud bragging, corporate titles, or stepping on others to feel important. Arrogance always demands an audience, but true capability operates in silence until the work is finished. And if this story reminds you to never let anyone else define your potential or determine your worth, hit that subscribe button right now. Because tomorrow, I am bringing you the unbelievable story of an underground tunnel technician who was publicly humiliated and fired by his corrupt city manager, only for the entire city's power grid to fail 4 hours later. And the city manager had to personally come down to the technician's small house on his knees to beg him to save the city. I'll see you in the next story.